How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects, candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
Welcome back to my conversation with Kevin Oakes, the CEO and co-founder of the Institute for Corporate Productivity. We've been talking about his new book, Culture Renovation, 18 Leadership Actions to Build an Unshakable Company. Kevin, I'm curious, is there kind of like a Cliff Notes version of your 18 steps, or maybe 2 or 3 big takeaways that our audience can say, you know what, I got it. That's the real key.
There aren't. Okay. I'll just say that.
That's fair.
There's no shortcuts when it comes to culture change. So let me walk through just how the book is organized.
Great.
I will reference some of the steps, not all of them, in that blueprint. As we started looking at those companies that were clearly successful in changing their culture, like a Microsoft, they were very thoughtful before they started trying to change the culture in planning on what they wanted to do. And as we got into this, we recognized that while a lot of people talk about culture transformation, and that's the term we were using initially and a lot of people use, none of these companies transformed their culture. They didn't go to something completely different from what they were. Instead, the better term we felt was renovation, because most of these organizations were keeping elements of what made them good to begin with. And just like an old house, keeping things that would be difficult to replace or things that made them unique, but renovating to improve the future value of the house or, in the context of an organization of the company. And so we felt the renovation theme made sense. And so we organized the steps like you would think about renovating an old house. And we segmented it into 3 categories or 3 phases of plan, build, and then maintain, and had significant steps underneath each. So I'll walk through quickly some of those phases for you. In the plan phase, the first thing we say is you need to develop and deploy a comprehensive listening strategy. And we have some really good stories from T-Mobile and other organizations where before they did anything, they made sure they understood the employee sentiment and the culture of the workforce. Okay. I think one of the worst things an executive team can do is lock themselves in a conference room and decide amongst themselves what the culture is today and what needs to be fixed, because they're going to get it wrong. They don't truly know everything that's happening at the ground level, particularly the larger the company is.
Right.
And so listening is happening in a lot of different formats. We've certainly done a lot more of it during the pandemic, and there's been a lot of employee surveys that have gone out to companies. Some companies are surveying on a monthly basis or a weekly basis. I write about companies that are even doing this on a daily basis in the book. Amazon is one of those companies that every day before you log on to your laptop or whatever device you're using, you have to answer a question, one question that they're posing to the entire workforce. And they use that question very strategically. The one that I highlighted in the book that got a lot of publicity by the press was, is your manager a simplifier or a complexifier? That's a good example of the types of questions they're asking, because it not only gets some good data, but also puts a question out there that people should contemplate. And it really, that particular question caused a lot of managers to think about their styles. Am I making things more complex for my team or simplifying things for my team? And they would also set conversations and tones inside the organization with the questions around DE&I or whatever topic they wanted to feature. So we go into great detail around listening strategy, but that's how the smart companies first started this process before they built anything.
That's a key part of the planning stage.
It is, and another key part of the planning too that I've spent a lot of time talking to folks about since I wrote this was identifying the influencers, the energizers, and even the blockers inside the organization. And, if you think about any large organization, there are people that are just go-to people inside the company. There are people that others turn to for subject matter expertise. they turn to for energy, they turn to for insight. And there are certain people in your life that you talk to and you walk away from those conversations pretty fired up. You get you're excited after you talk to them. And then there are others that suck the life out of you, right? So you want to make sure that before you are setting out on a culture renovation journey, you know who those influencers are because they're going to be your culture ambassadors long term. And most of the successful companies enlisted those people, hundreds of people oftentimes, to be culture ambassadors. And they were on the inside from the start of the culture change efforts. They were bought in. If they weren't bought in, they were, there was a lot of conversations on why they weren't bought in. But those are the people that make it happen at the ground level. Now, as a senior team, I guarantee you don't know who those people are. You know some of them, some of the obvious ones, and typically senior executives think in terms of a hierarchical chart. But the way workflow happens is not through a hierarchy. And when you map the workflow and map the collaboration, these hidden gems of people suddenly get illuminated. And you do that through a science we call organizational network analysis. And this is a survey technique, or you can also do it by monitoring, Slack or Teams or other communication channels. But we like the survey techniques a little bit better. And you triangulate on people that others say, are go-to people for them, people they need more time from, et cetera. And through that organizational network analysis, you uncover those hidden ambassadors who sometimes are introverts. They're not extroverts, and so it's easy to overlook them when trying to set up your culture committee or your culture ambassadors. So that's an important step and one that many of the successful companies took.
It's interesting. I had run into a company, and it was in Europe somewhere. One of our clients had recommended them, and I can't remember the name of it. You might even know them. And a big part of the work they do is what you just described, is they go into companies and they help to identify who are those influencers that you want to get on board, whether it's culture or anything else that you're trying to do. And it's an interesting perspective, again, in a much larger company, to think about who are those people who most influence the people around them, and making sure that you're enlisting them in whatever the change effort may be, whether it's culture or anything else that you're doing.
Well, that science that I just referenced is usually credited to Rob Cross. He's a professor at Babson, great friend and business partner of ours. And Rob has written many, many articles on this. He and I have co-written several articles in HBR, MIT, Sloan, or other places. And there's a lot of different uses for organizational network analysis. And we've documented how you can use it for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or return to work, as companies are thinking about, their return to work strategies. There's various uses for that. But I love it in the context of culture change, because you really want to make sure that you've got those people at the ground level. While culture change has to be leader-led, it's really hard to change a culture if the senior team or the CEO is not on board with it. It really gets carried out by having this co-creation mindset at the ground level, and those culture ambassadors become critical.
Got it. So let's go to, that's the planning stage. Then we have the building stage. What's one or two things in the building stage that you think are critical?
So the first step there is just clearly communicating that change is coming, and I later talk about painting a vision for the future. And there's been a lot of instances where particularly a new CEO will come in and immediately blame the predecessor or the mistakes of the past, or, and that it's amazing to me how often this happens, where it really just alienates the employees that were there and, were part of some of those mistakes, but also part of the success. And so painting that future vision, there's an art to that. And so I go into detail about how you do that. But also one of the hardest steps, I think, is ferreting out the skeptics and the non-believers, certainly at the senior levels or positions of power very early on. That's where culture change efforts often get thwarted, is by people who feel like their power is being usurped or their territory is being intruded on. And for whatever reason aren't in line with the culture change efforts, those are the people that can really derail it long term. So it's important to know who those people are and then try to either get them on board with a culture change or gently, or sometimes not so gently, move them out of the way. And it was, it's fascinating. Satya, again, at Microsoft, he talks about how he had to do that in his organization. I interviewed the CEO of F5 Networks, a really fascinating company. And the CEO admitted, look, when I became CEO, I didn't think I was going to replace 8 out of the 9 direct reports that I inherited, but I ended up doing that because I just needed the right people on board to take us to the next level and be in line with this culture change. So that step is a bit of a tough one. Just going on to the desired behaviors and what we talked about a little while ago, the successful companies put a lot of effort into training all levels of leaders, so senior to mid-level to frontline leaders, on the behaviors that they expected. Employees are going to do what leaders do. They're not going to do what you wrote in a PowerPoint or framed on a wall. They're only going to do that if the leaders emulate that. And most of these organizations recognize that and put a lot of time, effort, and even budget into training those leaders on behaviors that they expected. And then just reinforcing those along the way. So that was another aspect of the build phase that I thought was pretty important. There are many other steps, but we're just doing the highlights here.
Yes, just the highlights. So now we build it. Now we've got to maintain what we've built so that it doesn't become the flavor of the month. So one or two, what are top things to do in maintaining?
Yeah, it can be easy to revert back to the way things used to be if you don't put the effort into maintaining it. One area that I really like is onboarding. As you're bringing new employees into the organization, instead of the old way we used to do onboarding years ago, where it was a half day or day long event where you got your laptop or equipment and badge and learned where the bathrooms
benefits
were.
Information.
Today, what the smart companies are doing is making onboarding all about relationships and how do we set you up with the right relationships inside the company to make you successful long term. And you've seen it many times. People who flame out after year one, they were lonely. They never really assimilated into the company and never really developed those relationships. So companies are putting a lot of effort into making sure that they establish those relationships for employees. And they're even starting long before day one on the job. Particularly today where acquiring talent is so challenging. There's a lot of ghosting that's going on. People will accept jobs and then never show up.
I hear that all the time. I hear that from people all the time. They don't even show up for the interview, let alone after they got the job.
Yes, well, that happens too. But, it's quite frustrating when you think somebody's going to show up after they've accepted an offer and they don't. And so a lot of companies are starting the onboarding process at the moment they accept the offer and just getting them assimilated into the company. And I think some of those efforts can thwart the ghosting. The one step that I really like in the maintain phase is the focus on talent mobility. I just wrote an article in HBR this summer about the importance of this. We find that high-performing organizations are very good at moving talent around the company, particularly high potential and high-performing talent. The problem in a lot of companies is you have managers who are talent hoarders. And I certainly have been guilty of this in my career, where you've got great people on your team and you don't want them going anywhere else in the company, right? You want to keep them on your team because they're making you successful. Talent hoarding is very detrimental to organizations. You create silos when you have too much talent hoarding. Those high potentials or high performers, they get frustrated because they're not moving in their career. And collaboration suffers as well as other things inside the organization unless you're moving that talent around. And what very smart companies are doing is putting in formal programs where they're rewarding and recognizing managers who are developing and moving talent. And once those former talent hoarders get known for promoting people or getting people's careers moving in a different direction, a funny thing happens. They become talent magnets, right? You want to go work for the guy or the gal that's going to get you promoted and get your career moving. And so I've seen this be very, very successful in certain organizations where people are never stale in their job, right? Every 2, 3 years, they're moving around, they're rotating. And this isn't just geographic, and usually it's not anything to do with geographic. This is sometimes lateral moves, sometimes promotions, but it's getting a much more well-rounded experience in the company. And that's a great way to maintain culture long term by having that rotation of people, that healthy rotation of people.
Makes a lot of sense. When you were talking about the onboarding, just a thought for you. One of the I teach a lot about that as well, and I use a particular word that we used in my first company and that I teach. We call it integration as opposed to onboarding, because it gets to that relationship concept that you're mentioning, that the purpose of this is to assimilate that new person into the organization and have them feel a part of the community. And so sometimes that word integration gives a different connotation to it.
Love it. Yeah, I think it does. It doesn't sound like it has a start and stop,
Exactly.
time, which onboarding can sound like that. So
Yes.
Yeah, I love it.
So tell me a little bit about, just switching gears a little bit, 2 questions I want to ask you. One is, you had referred to growth mindset. I know I've read a bit about that, but for our audience, talk to me about what is that and why is that so important?
Well, it's interesting. Before Microsoft adopted this, no one really ever talked about it. But it comes from a book written by Carol Dweck, who's a professor at Stanford. And the book is called Mindset. And the book was originally given to Satya Nadella by his wife because she thought he might relate to it just from a family and personal perspective. But as he was reading it and as he got promoted into the CEO role, he realized there's a concept in here that I really want to rally the company around. And that's the concept of growth mindset, which means that skills and abilities aren't always innate and often aren't innate. They can be learned, that we can learn from mistakes inside the organization. And what Satya is very famous for saying is, I want a culture of learn-it-alls, not a culture of know-it-alls. And the culture he inherited was know-it-alls. Microsoft is famous for it. They have lots and lots of smart people, but people were using knowledge as power inside the organization. They would withhold knowledge to make themselves more powerful, make their groups more powerful. And so knowledge sharing wasn't very prevalent. And Satya grew up in that culture. He knew that that was the case, and he knew that had to change. And that's been a big, big change inside the company. Today, knowledge sharing is power. And Satya emulates his passion for learning on a constant basis. And he just considers himself a lifelong learner. And so they've trained everybody inside the company on the concept of growth mindset to the point they even have little posters in conference rooms that will say, is this going to be a growth mindset meeting or a fixed mindset meeting? And then they have little bullet points underneath each as to what they mean by that. But that's the term that will forever be associated with Microsoft's culture change.
Fascinating. So one of the general question, in the literature and the conversations around culture, there is so much being written and talked about engagement, employee engagement. And I'm curious for your perspective on, so how do, if at all, how do employee engagement, how is that different from culture, if at all, from your perspective?
I think it's an aspect of culture. I think, there's a lot of elements to culture, and certainly how engaged your employees are is a big component of that. But there's a lot of ways to measure employee engagement. I usually think about it in the terms of discretionary effort. How much discretionary effort are people putting in? Just how passionate are they about the work and about the company and about the purpose? And I didn't even talk about that, but that's a big part of the planning phase is developing a purpose that everybody can rally around. So I think employee engagement is an important aspect, but I caution companies, don't take your annual engagement study and think that's what your culture is, because oftentimes it does not give you the full picture. What's wrong with a lot of those engagement surveys is they're a point-in-time survey for an organization. And, things can be happening at that point in time that give you sort of a false positive of issues inside the company. That tend to dissipate, over a week or two, and then you survey them again, and suddenly that's not a big issue anymore. That's why you need more regular pulse surveys or always-on feedback, and there's a lot of great technology that helps that. to get a true sentiment of the workforce and really understand the engagement of the workforce and where you've got strengths and weaknesses.
I also think what I would add to that from my perspective is one could be engaged theoretically and still not be doing the behaviors you want them to be doing. Somebody could be a jerk and they're engaged. And simply being engaged isn't enough.
Yeah, I talk about that in the book, and I reference the great book that Bob Sutton, another Stanford professor, wrote called The No Asshole Rule, and that's literally the title of the book. And he actually had to run around to a bunch of different publishers because he wanted that to be the title of the book, and some did not want to put a swear word in the title of the book. But it's a pretty simple concept, but an important one that you really the ends doesn't justify the means, and we've all had people like this in organizations that we've worked with. There are these brilliant jerks who are very successful at what they do, but they just cause havoc, in the course of them doing their business. In a lot of situations, you've got to move those people out, and they can do so much more harm to the culture and to the overall organization versus the individual performance that they're putting up. And
Absolutely.
You're absolutely right. Those are dangerous folks.
There's a thing that I do in workshops that I deliver on this material, and I'll typically have a group of CEOs together. These are usually smaller to mid-sized companies, but same is true in a larger company. And I'll ask them, we'll talk about those assholes, for lack of a better word, who are usually high performers in terms of what they produce, but are cultural misfits or cynics or poison in many respects. And I'll ask the CEO, so how many of you have ever fired one of these people? And almost all of them raise their hand that at some point in their career, they've had to fire one of those people. And I ask them, what did everybody else say when you did? And practically in unison, they'll say, thank God, we were wondering when you were going to do this.
Yeah.
And then I ask them even the bigger question. I'll say, what did you say to yourself after you fired them? And almost in unison, they'll say, I should have done this a long time ago. That in retrospect, afterwards, they realize that they should have done it a long time ago. They realize just how much damage those people were doing that they didn't fully appreciate until they finally made the decision. And then they're kicking themselves because they should have done it a long time ago.
I've been there, and you oftentimes will fret about the impact that letting somebody like that go can have on performance, and particularly the financials. But when you get a collective hallelujah from the workforce when that person
is a pretty good indication that was a good idea.
That's right.
And what I've certainly seen is almost in the vast majority of times, the things we feared losing, the customers we thought we were going to lose, the production, the sales volume or whatever, doesn't take place. That the rest of the team rallies, the rest of that collective hallelujah was because the rest of the team were going to rally around this and make sure we don't lose the things that we worried about losing. So all those things we feared that kept us from making the decision don't take place.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And those are CEOs that put the culture above other interests, right? And
yes.
I think it's just a good example of how important the overall culture is to the organization.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a fascinating conversation, Kevin. I really appreciate your research-based take on this. That honestly, you and I are very aligned in almost all of what you describe and all of what I write about and teach. Mine comes from experience with small to mid-sized companies. Yours comes from research, validated research on thousands of companies. But what's interesting is they align almost perfectly in the same concepts, which is just fascinating for me to hear. And again, I really value and appreciate your research base and the volume of research you've done to validate what it is that you're promoting and teaching.
Well, thanks. And I'll compliment my team. I've got some great analysts on the team, and they're the ones doing the research. I just bask in the glory of the great data that they collect.
You get to look smart when they do all the real work.
That's right. But I think anybody who has picked up the book, or if you're thinking about reading the book, you'll find that it's not only got some good data in it, but just stories that really help bring that data to life. And I've always felt that those two things are so critical to go together, right? It's data is one thing, but if you can really take a real life story and show where that data has been applied, then it sticks and people get it.
So, Kevin, if people wanted to learn more, of course, obviously your book, I'm sure, is available in all forms, Culture Renovation, 18 Leadership Actions to Build an Unshakable Company. Is it on Audible as well?
It is. Yep. It's
Great.
digital. It's on Audible. There's a separate website for the book itself at that URL, culturerenovation.com.
Okay, so culturerenovation.com. And if people wanted to connect with you to learn more about you, where do they go?
I'm at i4cp.com, and even from that Culture Renovation website, you'll see my contact info. There's a number of things that complement the book out at that website as well. I write a monthly newsletter around this topic. We have some tools and some case studies that aren't in the book that people can use. So a lot of other resources available to them as well.
That's great. Well, thank you again, Kevin. I really appreciate your insights, really valuable, and I appreciate you taking the time to share them with our audience.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It's been fun.
My pleasure, Kevin. And that's it for another episode of Culture Architects. If you enjoy the show, make sure you take a second to subscribe so that you'll automatically get my new shows whenever they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I'd love it if you'd left us a review so that more folks like you can discover the show. I'll see you next time.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Be sure to join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders from all walks of life. To book David for your event or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of Forbes Books.